Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. That snow you just saw was from a week or two ago, and sadly, it did not stick at all. Still, it made things immediately feel like winter around here. Things have been busy, and I apologize for not having a video up in a while. I've been thinking about how to make a better schedule for the coming year. I'm hoping to do some planning in the next couple of weeks. For the last several months, I realize I haven't been talking much about what I've actually been reading each week. Today, I want to change that a bit and talk at least a bit about two or maybe three books that have really been standouts for me and made a big impact on me personally. The first book is one I've mentioned before, but not discussed in any detail. An academic book called The American Slave Narrative and the Victorian Novel by Julia Sun-Joo Lee. Scholars not infrequently consider the influence of English literature on the U.S. during the Victorian period, but less so the influence of American texts on English literature. Old-timers here know that I'm an historian of the U.S. South, the antebellum period through the early part of the 20th century. Everything from very formal written documents of people like Frederick Douglass to transcriptions of oral histories made in the 1930s with former slaves are often called slave narratives. Julia Lee is thinking here about the formal narratives that were not only published in the 19th century, but widely circulated in England during the Victorian period. Britain abolished slavery in the country in 1833, but slavery in the U.S. continued for 3 more decades. During those years, British abolitionists were quite active in the effort to end slavery in America, and many people who had escaped slavery and become abolitionists spent a lot of time in England for a variety of reasons, but partly because of the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850. In this study, Lee considers how the narrative accounts of people who had escaped from slavery or who had been freed in some other way shaped a set of classic British texts of the era, the work of Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell, William Makepeace Thackeray, etc. The whole book is interesting, and I'll set up the general argument, but I think I'm going to focus mainly on Lee's reading of Bronte's Jane Eyre. Many of you know that Jane Eyre is my very favorite novel of all time, and one I have read and reread more than almost any other book, I think, starting when I was about 12 years old. No, I still haven't made a really detailed discussion of it here on YouTube, but I'm going to try to do that in Victober of 2025. Okay? In her introduction, Julia Lee argues that British authors not infrequently integrated elements of the slave narrative genre. For the last few years, we've talked about the importance of the so-called marriage plot in not only Victorian fiction, but in contemporary fiction today. Lee's book points out other common plots, the fugitive and emancipation plots, where a person or character starts out in a situation of slavery or oppression of some other sort, and over the course of the book moves, often via resistance and rebellion, to a place of freedom. We see Charlotte Bronte writing in Jane Eyre about what she, and her sisters as well, thought of as governess slavery, which of course was not anything new with the Brontes. Elizabeth Gaskell is thinking about geographic and economic divisions across the country in North and South. And Dickens uses slave narratives as a model to talk about the treatment of convicts in Great Expectations. The fugitive plot and the emancipation plot are also key in other works by all of these authors, although their texts don't always explicitly reference American slavery. I won't go into it here, but Julia Lee addresses the complex response to using American slavery just as a metaphor, something that Frederick Douglass himself, the author of perhaps the most famous slave narrative, frequently pointed out. Julia Lee goes through a variety of tropes common in slave narratives and looks at when and how they start to appear in British fiction. Some of the elements she finds are remarkably parallel, while others are not particularly different from some of the tropes that appear commonly in spiritual conversion narratives, etc. and Lee acknowledges that in her text. In addition, she acknowledges that the model of the slave narrative gave authors a way to talk about a moral message while at the same time presenting what was often sensationalist, including torture or sexual violence and the thrill of escape. So, on to Jane Eyre. I suspect many readers of Jane Eyre think Julia Lee might have focused on the character of Bertha Mason. And while she does mention her, the bulk of Lee's discussion is about the various steps Jane herself makes as she runs away from her past, the past that was her fictive or metaphoric slavery. She shows that many of the episodes in Jane Eyre are less defined by Jane's arrivals than they are by her escapes. In each case, she's escaping in search of freedom and liberation. One of the common tropes in American slave narratives is the story of how literacy is a tool for liberation. And in Jane Eyre, there are numerous moments where reading either causes punishment or allows for at least a certain kind of escape. I don't think Lee points it out, but it does seem relevant here. Jane is a bit obsessed with the book History of British Birds, and perhaps the most famous line in Jane Eyre is a quote referring to both birds and emancipation. Quote, "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will." There's so much more in Lee's book, and I definitely recommend it if you're intrigued by this approach. Let me mention one more little thing. When Jane abruptly leaves her governess job at Thornfield, she's told that the norm is for advertisements to run in the papers. Lee points out that it was quite common for governesses to run away from jobs where they felt they were being mistreated, and that these newspaper announcements included physical descriptions and sometimes offered rewards for the returns of these runaway governesses. For any historian of slavery in America, these words immediately bring to mind newspaper announcements of runaway slaves, also featuring physical descriptions and rewards for a return. As Lee points out, Jane changes her name, just as many runaways, including Frederick Douglass, did, both to avoid recapture, but also to symbolize, quote, their rebirth as free men. And of course, Charlotte Bronte did something similar. She hid herself away and made a place for her work by changing her name, publishing her books initially under an androgynous pen name, Currer Bell. This is an academic book published by an academic press, and it's therefore quite expensive, even used, if you can't acquire it through your library or interlibrary loan, which is what I did. If you can get your hands on it, it is really fascinating. Okay, on to another book. This was one of my very favorite nonfiction books of the past several years. Tracy Kidder's Rough Sleepers, Dr. Jan O'Connell's urgent mission to bring healing to homeless people. This book got a fair amount of attention in the book world, as well as here on BookTube. Years before this book came out, Tracy Kidder wrote a book called Mountains Beyond Mountains about the activist physician Paul Farmer. My husband David might have called this his favorite book of nonfiction ever. The two of us read it together for a book club we were both participating in, and David knew that had he taken a slightly different path before he'd read it, Paul Farmer might have been his role model. Dr. Farmer used his knowledge of infectious disease to make a difference in global health problems. He considered how financial systems and politics impacted healthcare in a variety of locations, including everywhere from Russia to Haiti. While David did not follow Farmer into the practice of global medicine, he was tremendously moved by the story of his activism. Healthcare, this book insisted, could be one of the most life-saving kinds of activism that exists. And this was an idea that David had long known. Actually, very early in his life, his middle-class parents had hoped he would become a physician. The story the family told was that when his father saw him for the very first time, instead of crying out, "It's a boy," he yelled, "It's a doctor." But medicine was not the path David wanted to pursue. He majored in anthropology in college, and he considered going to graduate school in the field. He also thought about becoming a rabbi, but wasn't convinced that congregational work would be the right fit for him. What he really wanted to do, although his parents were skeptical, was be an activist. So right after college, he decided to work for a couple of years at the Religious Action Center, the RAC, in Washington, D.C., a Jewish organization committed to social justice. One of the issues he was assigned randomly to focus on during his internship was healthcare. This was back in 1990 or so. In D.C., he spent his days on Capitol Hill lobbying senators and House representatives on a variety of issues. And during his evenings, he volunteered at shelters for people who lived without consistent housing. It soon became apparent to him that the issues he was facing during his days at the RAC were massively more complicated for unsheltered people. Often, the health issues caused the homelessness, especially when ill or disabled people couldn't get jobs or couldn't maintain them. And often homelessness was the cause of health issues, too. Poor diet, exposure to the elements, a lack of access to health care and to health insurance, etc., all led to poor health. And of course, even when unsheltered people managed to receive care for their emergency health issues, it was often hard to follow up on long-term care if people didn't have regular addresses. By the end of the internship, David realized that what he wanted to do with his life was to provide health care to people who were struggling in this world. Much to his parents' pleasure, he applied to medical school, but what he decided to do there was quite different from what I think they had in mind. During his first year of med school, David started working with a relatively new organization, one called Healthcare for the Homeless. This is the organization that Tracy Kidder writes about in his book, Rough Sleepers. Kidder is talking about the young Dr. Jim O'Connell, who makes house calls in a van as he provides care to unhoused people living on the streets in Boston. During the summer after David's first year of medical school, he ran a similar van, which served people in Philadelphia, doing the same kind of thing with a cadre of fellow medical students and residents and practicing physicians. After medical school and residency, he ran clinics for D.C. residents who could not afford health care. And then shortly before Obama was elected, he started doing healthcare policy work for the federal government, aimed at providing needed care to people who were underserved by the U.S. system of healthcare. Before he died, he became the acting director of his federal agency. I've been thinking about not only the importance of his work, but about how his agency might be affected by the recent changes in national leadership, and also wondering how David might have dealt with what seems to be coming down the pike here in the U.S. At any rate, David would have loved the book Rough Sleepers. I wish I could share it with him. Well, on to the third book. I recently stumbled across The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening our democracy, written by Matthew D. Taylor. Taylor himself grew up in an evangelical community and then pursued advanced education in religious studies. He's now written an academic study about how non-denominational charismatic Christianity developed over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. What he's focusing on in this book is the rise of Christian nationalism, its support of contemporary right-wing politics, and its influence on what happened at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, 2021. How evangelical and charismatic sects developed through the United States in recent decades, and how faith could be politicized is really outside my wheelhouse. But Taylor is a powerful guide. His research for this book is based on access to not just archives and correspondence, but to internal conference calls and interviews with leaders of various charismatic sects. When I was a young person, right before Ronald Reagan's presidency, we saw the rise of evangelical influence in politics. The so-called moral majority supported and shaped the conservative politics of the Republican Party. Evangelicals supported, quote, traditional family values with its conservative ideas about gender and sexuality, etc. They were concerned about abortion, mothers working outside the home, and feminism more broadly to a degree, homosexuality, the rising rates of, quote, broken families due to divorce. They sometimes demonized African American families, especially when women raised children without patriarchs in their households and became so-called welfare queens that supposedly misused governmental assistance. For the decades before Reagan, people on the left had been committed to expanding the civil and social rights of groups of people who had long been marginalized or vulnerable. But this commitment was at odds with the political right, or at least the social conservatives within the party, who were less committed to individual rights and more committed to traditional community norms. Jimmy Carter, a Democratic candidate from Georgia who won the 1976 election, actually was himself an evangelical Christian, although he did not support socially conservative policies. The newly formed moral majority supported the candidate running against him in 1980, the first president to be elected with formal support from an evangelical organization was Ronald Reagan, someone who seemed to be an odd bedfellow as far as I was concerned. He was our first divorced president, for example, something that didn't fit particularly well with social conservatism at the time. It's been even harder for me to understand why so many evangelicals endorsed Trump, whose womanizing, etc., has been quite public. But I should have learned from Reagan that it's not the candidate's personal faith or behavior that matters to the evangelical voting bloc, but instead the socially conservative policies the candidate endorses, or at least sometimes claims to endorse. My little summary here is quite an oversimplification. And as I already said, I am no expert in this field. This is just my effort to give a little context or background about what I thought before I read Matthew Taylor's book, which shocked me at every turn and opened my eyes to a part of the story with which I was utterly unfamiliar. Taylor's major point is to sketch out how non-denominational charismatic evangelicalism became connected to the rhetoric of hard-right politics, including how that kind of faith got connected to the coup at the United States Capitol on January the 6th. Key to this is the idea of spiritual warfare in a variety of forms. Instead of supporting policies that bolstered traditional families, these charismatics have tried to construct a Christian nation and world, even when that effort requires a questioning of the principles of democracy. First, the title comes from a section from the New Testament, Matthew 11, where Jesus speaks about the blind receiving sight, the dead arising, ministry to the poor, etc. A few verses into the chapter, we get this, quote, "The kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force." People have read this in a variety of ways. Does it refer to people who opposed the kingdom of heaven and were attacking it? Or perhaps violence really just means excitement, when believers were so excited to enter heaven that it seemed like they were storming the gates. Or more metaphorically, just that throngs of people wanted to hear the gospel. Some charismatic leaders and their followers read this very differently, essentially as a call to fight against evil through both prayer and spiritual aggression in order to claim their rightful inheritance. That is, access to the kingdom of heaven is not given by grace, but instead must be, quote, taken, and taken through force. For many people, that violence is not physical violence, but instead an intense and aggressive zeal about spreading their faith. But sometimes that spiritual violence might spur on physical violence. And Taylor suggests that that is exactly what happened at the January 6th coup. It's not that the charismatic leaders broke into the Capitol that day, but they were waging their so-called spiritual warfare to encourage the people who did riot by doing things like kneeling on the ground and praying for the rioters, and by bolstering the legitimacy of the coup by emphasizing that it was, in their opinion, religiously mandated. In other words, the coup was only partly a riot. It was also a revival. So let me take just a moment to talk about how Taylor structures the book. He writes a series of mini biographies of leaders who were active in the development of the charismatic faith over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. The individual biographies are presented more or less in chronological order, although, of course, people who were introduced in the book in early years because of their impact then often reappear later in the book when something new happens. And that can lead to a bit of repetition or confusion, but still, this sequential biography approach helps make the book feel quite accessible, even to readers like me who know very little about these communities. So how on earth did Trump get pulled into this? He was raised a mainline Presbyterian, at least nominally, and mainline Presbyterians are not charismatic. The most convincing argument to me is that Trump didn't choose the Charismatics chose him, partly because of their acceptance of the prosperity gospel. That is, the belief that people who God loves will be rewarded with abundant wealth on earth. They saw his wealth as a sign of God's favor, regardless of whether Trump had faith himself. And you can see why it might be tempting to Trump to think that he was wealthy because he was God's chosen one, or that other people thought that, even if he didn't come to that idea through faith himself. There's also another angle to the prosperity gospel, a backstory. I first learned about the prosperity gospel in Kate Bowler's memoir about her diagnosis with what she thought was terminal cancer. Bowler is a professor of religion at Duke University, and she had made an academic study of the ideas of the prosperity gospel prior to her illness. One of its key principles is not just that God's favor manifests as wealth, but that it manifests as health. And here, too, we see Trump talking about his extraordinary health, better than anyone's health, he says, at great length. And for many people, and possibly for Trump himself, his wealth and health is proof of his chosen status. Maybe especially because he was apparently chosen even though he had not sought out God's blessings. This might be obvious, but people on the left, Christians and non-Christians, don't tend to support the idea of the prosperity gospel. It implies that poor people are undeserving, or that sick people brought their illnesses upon themselves in some way. Still, it was this kind of attribution of weakness that was exactly how the early prosperity gospel worked. Revivals and eventually televangelists argued that accepting the word of God and doing the good deed of donating to religious leaders like themselves could heal the sick, maybe instantly. And to use those first verses from Matthew 11 again, their faith would make the deaf hear and allow the lame to walk, etc. Back to Trump. One of the key figures here is Paula White, who essentially became the personal pastor to Trump even before his first run for the presidency. After he was inaugurated, she and other non-denominational charismatics began to gain more power with a more mainstream evangelical world, as the mainstreamers saw the charismatics as a way to have more access to the president's team. So many of these charismatic evangelical leaders And many of the more mainstream evangelicals align themselves with the MAGA wing of the party, thinking that God had anointed Trump, even if he himself might not be a Christian, to usher in a new era. No longer was the main goal just government support of traditional family values, as we mostly saw in the moral majority years. Instead, they seemed to want anti-democratic Christian supremacy and dominionism, with its additional threat of violence. As the book goes on, Taylor describes a series of not entirely overlapping religious arguments. The Seven Mountains, for example, which did not require someone to be an evangelical Christian in order to lay the groundwork for a Christian takeover of not only politics, but education, media outlets, the corporate world, etc. Another set of beliefs is embodied in the Appeal to Heaven flag, which was at the heart of the recent discussion of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito and his wife. And display of the flag is often linked directly straight to right-wing politics. Sometimes those of us on the left hear that people on the right think of us as demonic. We usually assume that they couldn't actually think that. But Taylor shows that, at least to a degree, some of the charismatics really do believe Democrats are truly evil, working actively against the wishes of God. I had assumed that a lot of that kind of rhetoric was simply hyperbolic, just as I'd assumed that talk of Trump's astounding health was just a weird way to express some kind of narcissism. But all of this is, I think, explained much better by looking at it through the lens that Taylor shows us in this book. To sum up, the violent take it by force is often terrifying, but it's always insightful and compelling as well. I highly recommend it. At least in my local library system, an audio version is available through the Hoopla app, but not a text version. Well, I think that will do it for today. Next time I'll try to make a more cheerful video, maybe one of the great tags going around. Thank you so much for sticking with me today, though. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.